The night Calvin Miller cheated, my daughter and I were kidnapped to the deep mountains by his archenemy. My daughter had an asthma attack. When I called him for help, he said to me with disgust, "Stop using Annie's illness to deceive me. If she isn't dead, don't bother me." Later, Annie really died. He knelt on the ground, crying his heart out, clutching my hand, and said, "Let's have another child, okay?" I looked at him with empty eyes. "Who are you?" "Mom, will Dad come to save us?" My daughter curled up in my arms, looking at me with fearful eyes. My hands and feet were tied. I lowered my head and rubbed my daughter's forehead with my chin, comforting her. "He will. Dad will definitely come to save Annie." After speaking, I looked up at the person in front of me and said, "Give me the phone." Jason White, dressed in black, spat out the cigarette in his mouth and walked over, handing the phone to me. "Tell him to bring $20 million in cash. Don't say anything else." I nodded. Jason White was Calvin's archenemy. They had been at odds since childhood, fighting fiercely over business. A year ago, Calvin ruined Jason's company. From the heir of the White family to now living in a rented apartment, he hated Calvin's dirty methods to the core. This afternoon, I took my daughter Annie out to play and was kidnapped by him halfway to the deep mountains, into a dilapidated house with leaking walls. I called twice, but no one answered. Jason glared at me impatiently, and I dialed again. My daughter's face was blue from the cold, her body trembling, and she started coughing. I stared at the phone, and suddenly it connected. I instinctively called out, "Calvin." Jason reached over and pinched my shoulder, making me wince in pain. I steadied my voice. "Annie and I got lost. Can you come and pick us up?" My daughter raised her head and shouted into the phone. "Daddy, Daddy, save me," sob. "Annie is so cold, Uncle White is so scary." Calvin only spoke after hearing his daughter's voice. "Where did you take Annie again?" His tone was full of disgust, and then a sudden panting moan came from the other side. "Calvin, it hurts, you come out first." I froze. My heart ached. Yes, I knew he was cheating. The one lying in his arms was his beloved, Bertha. Bertha went abroad after graduating from college and later returned to join his company. Half a year ago, when their scandal reached my ears, I once caught them hugging each other. At that time, Calvin explained that she had drunk too much. I suppressed my emotions and spoke to the person on the phone. "Bring $20 million to save us now." Calvin sneered, "What trick are you playing now? Kidnapping? Shelley, can you be any more shameless?" He didn't believe me. I struggled with my wrists and had just said a word when I suddenly noticed that my daughter's face was off. She was struggling to breathe and fell from my body. I screamed, "Annie, Annie. Calvin, come and save Annie." Annie had an asthma attack. This was the last thing I wanted to see. But Calvin interrupted me with disgust. "Stop using Annie's illness to deceive me. If she isn't dead, don't bother me." The phone hung up quickly, and my words were scattered in the wind. Annie lay on the ground with her mouth open, her small hands clutching her chest, tears continuously streaming from her eyes. I threw myself beside my daughter, crying and begging Jason White. "Jason, I'll give you anything, please let me go and save my daughter, she has asthma." He panicked too and carried Annie with me to the nearest hospital. The doctor said it was too late, the child's body was already stiff. I felt absurd, lost all reason and composure, and started arguing with the doctor. "She's just wearing too little, and it's cold. Hurry up and save her. You are doctors, why won't you save my daughter? Please, save her, save her." Jason stopped me from pouncing on the doctor. "Shelley." I clung to Jason like grabbing a lifeline. "Tell them to save my daughter quickly, I'll give you any amount of money. Calvin has money, I'll make him give it all to you, and more." He showed a trace of emotion, helping me to stand up. All the doctors looked at me with regret. "Please accept our condolences." A rush of blood hit my head, and I tasted blood on my tongue. I felt dizzy, and my vision went black. When I woke up, I saw my parents, Calvin's parents, and a bunch of relatives and friends. But Calvin was nowhere to be seen. When Annie's ashes were placed into the box, Calvin Miller arrived at the hospital late. He looked at the urn, shedding a few hot tears. His eyes were bloodshot as he questioned me in grief. Why didn't you wait for me? I felt as if my heart was dead. Mechanically, I turned my head to look at the man I had loved for 12 years. Weren't you the one who didn't believe? Didn't you say I was lying to you? Didn't you say if she isn't dead, don't bother you? He suddenly flew into a rage, got up, and slapped me. My brother rushed over, grabbed him, and punched him back, cursing loudly. How dare you blame my sister? If you hadn't used underhanded means to take over Jason White's company, would he have kidnapped my sister and Annie? Calvin seemed to be struck by a bolt from the blue, looking at me in disbelief. Kidnapped? He kidnapped you? Screw him, Calvin, give me back Annie's life. You deserve to die. Bruce threw him to the ground and sat on him, punching him. The two of them wrestled together. My parents and friends rushed to break up the fight, and the scene was chaotic. I seemed to hear my daughter's laughter, so I picked up the urn and ran outside. On the street, cars were passing by, just like the road Annie and I had walked on that day. Annie's tender voice was teaching me how to cross the road. Hand in hand, we crossed the road, but when I looked down, my hand was empty, and Annie was gone. The green light on the other side was about to change. I stopped in the middle of the street, anxiously turning around to find my daughter, Annie. The sound of horns urged me, and I ran across the street, only to be hit by a right-turning motorcycle. I heard someone shouting at me, "Shelley, don't die." I had a head injury, with a blood clot in my brain. The doctor said surgery might cause amnesia. They asked me to consider carefully whether to opt for conservative treatment or a craniotomy. Seeing Bertha in a professional suit appear in the ward, I actually wanted to lose my memory immediately. I turned my head and asked Calvin, who was sitting in a chair peeling an apple for me. "Why did you let this spiteful woman come?" Calvin's face darkened. "Don't speak so harshly." I laughed coldly, suddenly grabbing the knife from his hand and throwing it at Bertha. She screamed in fright and crouched on the floor, covering her head. The knife stuck into the wall. Calvin dropped the apple and stood up abruptly, suddenly stopping in his tracks, turning back to yell angrily. "Are you crazy?" I stared straight at him. "Calvin, while you were rolling in bed with that woman, your daughter died on the road." Bertha lifted her frightened face, explaining pitifully. "Mrs. Miller, I'm here on behalf of the company to offer my condolences. Mr. Miller and I didn't do anything." Her pitiful voice made me want to vomit. "Didn't do anything?" "You were groaning on the phone." "Miss Bertha, have you ever been a prostitute?" Bertha cried even harder, kneeling on the floor, and Calvin went over to help her up, continuing to shout at me. "Shelley, don't go too far. Bertha is not like you, she didn't use every means to get into my bed." I smiled faintly. So, this was how he saw me. 12 years, from high school until now, and my love still hadn't warmed his icy heart. I ignored the disgusting couple, pressed the call button, and summoned the doctor. "Doctor, I'll have the surgery." Calvin walked up to me, his face dark, and asked, "You want to forget me?" I raised my head and forced a smile that was worse than crying. "Isn't that what you wanted? Before the surgery, let's get a divorce." Because both of our parents were against our divorce. Calvin was unwilling to do so. I had no choice but to undergo brain surgery first. Before the surgery, I met Bertha again. Calvin said she felt guilty and volunteered to take care of me after the surgery. I laughed angrily and had my brother kick them out directly. After the surgery, I still remembered everything, everyone. The pain in my heart didn't lessen at all. I was a bit disappointed. Not only that, but Calvin even took a special leave to accompany me. Seeing him made me feel nauseous. Unexpectedly, Calvin started to suspect what happened during my kidnapping. He questioned me, "What else did Jason White do besides tying you up?" I was stunned, looking up at my increasingly unfamiliar husband. "What are you suspecting?" Calvin didn't answer my question but instead talked about his investigation of Jason White over the past few days. "I've been looking for him these days, couldn't find him in the country. He must have fled abroad. That day, he only saw you." I said coldly, "What exactly do you want to say?" Calvin said coldly, "Did you two have sex?" I had never felt this disgusted with someone before. I laughed a few times, stood up, and slapped him hard, shouting, "Get out!" The door was suddenly pushed open, and Bertha rushed in, pulling Calvin with a heartache. Calvin's face suddenly turned dark, his eyes gloomy. She accused me, "Shelley, Mr. Miller cares so much about you, and you actually hit him." I sneered, "I trusted you and let you into the company, and you seduced my husband. Do you have any shame?" Bertha's face turned white, then red, then black. She squeezed out a few tears, her voice trembling. "I didn't. What evidence do you have? Mr. Miller and I are just good friends. It's true that he takes good care of me, but I've never actively destroyed your family." I didn't want to see her act innocent again, so I blurted out, "Get out." Calvin grabbed my hand and growled, "Can you stop going crazy?" I asked her to come. "If you're angry, take it out on me." I turned to look at him and smiled, "All right." Then I raised my hand to hit his face, but Bertha rushed up to block it. "If you want to hit me, ah." Bertha's face immediately had 3 bloody scratches from my fingertips. She covered her face and fell to the ground, and Calvin hurried to help her up. Seeing her face, he turned around and pushed me. My lower abdomen hit the cabinet. A sharp pain made me bend over, listening to Calvin's impotent rage at me. "You killed our daughter. If it wasn't for you taking her out, she wouldn't have been kidnapped, she wouldn't have gotten sick. It's all your fault. The one who should die is you." His voice drilled into my ears like a curse. "Right. I killed our daughter. Annie died in front of me. She was in so much pain, and I couldn't do anything. I will accompany her. Mommy will accompany Annie." I slowly straightened up and walked to the window, opened it. But before my hand could touch the windowsill, I was hugged and pulled away. Because Calvin repeatedly provoked me, I fainted several times. The doctor didn't allow him to come to the hospital anymore. I had a moment of peace. Until one day, a figure suddenly appeared at the door. Jason White was dressed very strictly, with a hat and mask. He only took them off after entering the ward. Seeing him triggered my stress response, and I shrank into the blanket, warning him, "Don't come near." Jason stopped at my words and quietly looked at me. I turned my head, my hand under the blanket clenched tightly, and I said hatefully, "Aren't you afraid I'll call the police and have you arrested?" Jason said, "You can call if you want." I threw off the blanket and went to the drawer to find my phone, but I didn't move once it was in my hand. The phone screen showed a photo of Annie. Tears fell onto the screen, on Annie's cute, smiling face. I cried and laughed. "What good would it do to arrest you? My Annie won't come back." Jason's voice was hoarse, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have used you all to get back at Calvin. I'm sorry for Annie." I clutched my phone, lowering my head to rub the tears off my cheeks. Jason and Calvin grew up as rivals, constantly competing because of their families. They competed in grades at school and girlfriends and love. In high school, more people liked Jason than Calvin because of his rebellious personality, handsome looks, and fierce fighting skills. Teenage girls loved that type. But I fell for the quiet Calvin, who rarely talked to girls. I pursued Calvin for 7 years, and in the 8th year, I finally married him. Jason asked me at my wedding, "Is he worthy of your love for so long?" I said he was worth it. He laughed at that time, suddenly leaned in to kiss me, and said, "You will regret it." Recalling the past made my head ache like needles. I suddenly told Jason, "I regret it. My persistence in chasing Calvin all those years was because of my love. Because I was too stubborn, I didn't see his heart clearly." At that time, Calvin also noticed that Jason seemed to have some feelings for me and started taking me to various parties frequently, showing off our love in front of everyone. Sometimes I could tell he was putting on a show, but I endured it because I loved him. I was really foolish. I was an idiot. I mocked myself, pinching my palm hard, my nails digging into my flesh. Jason suddenly walked over, grabbed my wrist, and pried my hand open, seeing the blood seeping from my palm, his brow furrowed. "Shelley, instead of torturing yourself, why not torture me?" He turned to find some tissues but saw Calvin standing at the door with a furious expression through the glass. I glanced at him lightly and turned my head. Calvin kicked the door open with a bang, charging in like an enraged lion, grabbing Jason and punching him hard. Jason took a few punches before fighting back. The two crashed into the room's tables and chairs, creating chaos. The doctor called for security, and it took 7 or 8 people to pull the two red-eyed fighters apart. Calvin's mouth was bleeding, and one eye was swollen. He roared, "Jason White, you murderer, how dare you come out? You killed Annie. You killed my daughter. Let me go. I want to beat him to death. Send him to prison. I want him dead." Jason was pulled aside and sat down, not saying a word, just looking up at me. Calvin suddenly cursed at me. "Shelley, how dare you collude with him and betray me? You two conspired to kill my daughter, you shameless dogs. I will kill you both. Kill you." I got out of bed and slowly walked to Jason. As soon as I squatted down, something heavy struck the back of my head. I looked back and saw Calvin's shocked expression, then he broke free from the others and rushed to hold me. I murmured, "I can finally die. Calvin, I'm going to die." I knew the back of my head had a hole, and blood was flowing out. The strong smell of blood almost made me faint. I heard Calvin shouting uncontrollably at the people nearby, "Quick, save her." I was held in his panicked embrace, and he kept calling my name. "Shelley, you can't close your eyes, you can't die. Do you hear me?" I didn't understand. It was clearly him who hit me, so why was he pretending to be so anxious? I closed and opened my eyes again, and in a daze, I seemed to see him crying. A bitter laugh welled up in my heart. Impossible. His beloved daughter died, and he didn't cry. If I died, why would he cry? Calvin Miller would never cry. It felt like I was being carried to a bed, and the scene in front of me gradually blurred. Suddenly, a memory from my university days flashed through my mind. It must be the final moments before death, a life review. On my 20th birthday, I went out to eat with friends, and when I came back, I saw Calvin waiting for me under the dormitory building. He gave me a bracelet. That was the first gift he gave me. I cherished it so much that I hardly wore it, only putting it on for birthdays and anniversaries, as if it instantly took me back to the year I was most moved. After graduation, I interned at Calvin's family company. During a gathering, he helped me block a drink, and we both got drunk. I bravely kissed him, and he kissed back. 2 years later, I unexpectedly got pregnant, and his parents demanded an immediate wedding. But within 3 months, I had a miscarriage. At that time, Calvin was very distressed about me, spoiling me endlessly. A year later, I got pregnant again and gave birth to Annie. I thought I would be happy like this forever. When Annie was 2 years old, Bertha suddenly appeared in front of Calvin. I had never seen Calvin lose his composure in front of others, nor had I ever seen such a stunning expression on his face. The shock in his eyes instantly turned into a regained love. It turned out that he loved someone else in his heart. When I woke up, I was surrounded by people. My brother urgently came forward to ask, "Sis, you're awake?" I recognized this voice well. It was my brother Bruce. He helped me sit up. When I looked up again, I was startled. Why were Dad and Mom crying? Wait, wasn't Bruce supposed to be in elementary school? I remember that I accidentally fell off the bed while trying to pick up something. And I clearly told my roommate that I didn't need to go to the hospital for this minor injury. "Are you my parents and Bruce?" Their faces changed instantly. Suddenly, someone came over, knelt on the ground, crying heart-wrenchingly, and grabbed my hand. "I shouldn't have quarreled with you. Let's have another child, okay?" I looked at him blankly. "Who are you?" Bruce's voice trembled. "You don't recognize him?" I shook my head. My head still hurt, and I didn't know what had happened. The doctor came over after hearing the news, examined me, and asked, "Do you know your name?" I nodded, "Shelley." Doctor asked calmly, "How old are you this year?" I frowned and replied, 18 years old. Everyone was shocked. Doctor asked again, "Do you recognize them?" I looked up at them, not very sure. They seem familiar. I reached out and tugged the doctor's coat. But they're not quite like what I remember. The doctor comforted me, "Your memory has some issues, but don't worry, these people are your family." Then he turned to them and said, "We can confirm she has amnesia." The man who had been crying just now seemed to go mad upon hearing the doctor's words. He rushed to my bedside, grabbed me painfully, and asked, "How can you forget me? I am your husband, Calvin Miller." He squeezed me so hard it hurt. Bruce pulled him away and punched him. "You bastard, get away, you almost killed my sister." After the man was pulled away, I carefully observed him. He indeed looked a lot like Calvin Miller, but the Calvin I liked was only 18 years old. The 18-year-old Calvin Miller didn't have a beard, nor would he be so unkempt. He was always clean and imposing. But this man looked too much like Calvin, their eyebrows and eyes were almost identical. I tentatively asked him, "Are you really Calvin Miller?" He suddenly grabbed my hand, placing his hand together with mine, his voice gentle enough to drip water. "Look, we have wedding rings, we are married, Shelley." The matching rings seemed real. I was both surprised and delighted, looking at him a bit shyly. "But I'm only 18, how could I be married to you?" He sat down, holding my face, his voice incredibly gentle. "It doesn't matter, it's okay if you can't remember for now, just remember that I'm your lover." Calvin took me home. I saw our wedding photos. So we were married. I used to dream of marrying him. Looking at the wedding photos, my chest suddenly ached. Calvin hurriedly held me and asked, "Where does it hurt?" I shook my head and asked him, "Do we have a good relationship?" Calvin said guiltily, "Very good." I asked him many things, and he answered patiently. Although he said so, I still had doubts in my heart. If our relationship was good, Bruce wouldn't have said those things in the hospital. The next day after dinner, I took a taxi to Calvin's company. And when I pushed the door open, I saw a woman massaging Calvin's shoulders. They were very close, with smiles on their faces. Seeing me, Calvin's eyes flashed a trace of panic. He quickly stood up from the chair. "Honey, why are you here?" The woman calmly called me Mrs. Miller. I didn't know why, but even though it was the first time we met, I disliked her. Ignoring Calvin, I directly looked at the woman and asked coldly, "What are you doing with my husband?" The woman softly explained, "I was just helping Mr. Miller relax." Calvin told her to leave and pulled me to sit on the resting sofa, concernedly saying to me, "Your health is not good, don't run around." The woman silently packed up the cups on the table, but one of the cups suddenly fell and shattered. Just as I was about to hold Calvin's hand, he suddenly withdrew his hand, got up to check on her, frowning with a displeased look. I thought Calvin would get angry, but he just softly reminded her, "Be careful." The woman softly acknowledged and then left. I asked Calvin who she was. Calvin simply explained, "A colleague from the company, you wouldn't be jealous, right?" "My secretary is a man." He suddenly reached out to touch my nose. "All right, I'll take you out for dinner." I felt that Calvin seemed afraid of me knowing something. Every time we talked about the company or that woman, he would change the subject. A woman's intuition is usually accurate. Calvin must be hiding something from me. At night, I woke up thirsty and heard him on the phone in the living room. He said to the other side, "I won't get a divorce. Don't call me at night anymore." Leaning against the door in a daze, I realized there must be something wrong with our marriage. Later I asked Bruce, but he changed his previous attitude of advising me to break up, telling me not to overthink. Calvin bought me a new phone, saying the previous one was lost. Looking at the empty contact list, I panicked, searched the house but couldn't find the phone book. Later I only managed to recall one number, dialed it, but a man's voice answered. Holding the phone, I hesitated to hang up. The other side suddenly spoke, "Hello, this is Jason White." Jason White. I knew him. I quickly arranged to meet Jason White, but when I saw him, I became unsure again. He looked almost like a different person from the Jason White in my memory. Although more mature and handsome, he seemed a bit desolate, as if he had aged a lot. I carefully opened my mouth. "I want to talk to you about my amnesia." Jason stared at me for a long time, then softly said, "If you can't remember, don't force it. Some things are better forgotten." I stared blankly at the coffee cup. Maybe he was right. I heard that people lose their memory because a protective mechanism kicks in, because the forgotten part would cause sadness. But I couldn't stand the blank memory, nor did I want to live in a lie. Was I going through a divorce before I lost my memory? Why ask me? My father, mother, brother, none of them would tell me. Jason smiled and asked back, do you think I would tell you? I lowered my head, slowly speaking, sorry. Jason suddenly lifted my head with his fingers, his voice gentle. Shelley, don't say sorry, the one who should apologize to you is someone else. After chatting with Jason White, I took a taxi to Calvin's company. The secretary said Calvin and Bertha had gone out. I waited in Calvin's office, flipping through his bookshelf, and found an album placed upside down. I picked it up, and the photo showed a family of 3. Calvin and that woman, with a cute child held in the middle. I took the photo and asked the secretary, who was that woman? But he only responded to me, you should ask Mr. Miller yourself. Obviously, he was avoiding the question. I turned around and walked out of Calvin's office. I randomly found someone and asked, who is this woman? Their expressions were the same as the secretary's, clearly having received Calvin's orders not to speak casually. Since they wouldn't tell me, I had another way. I directly offered, whoever tells me who this woman is, I'll give them a promotion and a raise. It didn't take long for a man to suddenly speak out from the crowd. Director Bertha is Mr. Miller's friend. Someone else added, she's not Mr. Miller's wife. Right, I'm Calvin's wife, how could she be? My head hurt so much, it felt like it was splitting. It seemed like someone had once whispered in my ear. He never liked you. If it weren't for the child, he wouldn't have married you. I staggered and turned around, crying as I threw myself into Calvin's arms, who had just walked in from outside. He held me, lowered his head, and asked with concern, what's wrong? Is your head hurting again? I'll take you to the hospital right away. I clutched Calvin's collar, sobbing and begging him. Calvin, tell me you don't like Bertha, tell me quickly. Calvin said calmly, I don't like her. Unexpectedly, there was not a trace of hesitation. But my heart still ached, and I shouted at him, then fire her. He hesitated for a moment, pushing my shoulders, trying to explain, but I interrupted with a scream. If you don't fire her, I'll divorce you. Calvin bent down to wipe away my tears. His expression was somewhat pained as he spoke to Bertha behind him. Bertha, pack your things and leave now. Bertha still wanted to argue, trying to explain to me, Mrs. Miller. I clutched my head in pain and screamed. Calvin covered my ears and shouted at her once more. Get out! Get out now! To appease me, Calvin took me shopping. From head to toe, as long as I showed interest, he would directly swipe his card. I temporarily forgot the painful scene just now, dragging him from store to store. Passing by a toy store, I let go of his hand and quickly ran inside, circling around like a curious baby. Finally stopping in front of a plush toy shelf, squatting down and staring at a panda plushie in a daze. He laughed at me for being like Annie. I tilted my head and asked him, who's Annie? Calvin's smile froze on his face, and he slowly said, Annie is the name we chose for our child. You said we should name the child before they were born. I turned my head, reached out to touch the plushie, and said happily, then let's buy it for Annie. Later, we went to watch a movie. When we came out, I was thirsty, and Calvin went to buy me a milk tea. I leaned against the railing, bored, observing passers-by. Suddenly, I caught sight of Jason White across from me. He also saw me and quickly turned his head. I walked around half a circle and greeted him, Hi, Jason. Jason seemed surprised that I approached him, responding slowly, Shelley. I asked him, what are you doing here? He hesitated for a long time before saying, handling some business. Actually, I had long noticed he was following us. I had just said a few words to him when Calvin suddenly returned, throwing the other cup of milk tea at Jason's face. I instinctively went to block it, and it hit my head. Calvin shouted at me angrily, why do you keep protecting him again and again? Jason glared at him, warning in a low voice, Calvin, don't shout at her. Calvin, like an angry lion declaring his territory, said, she is my wife. He forcibly dragged me away, got into the car, and started it without a word. Calvin drove very fast, and I was a little scared. Calvin, please slow down. He didn't respond to me. I nervously clutched the car door and asked him, "You're mad because I didn't like you before I lost my memory and the one I liked actually is Jason?" Calvin suddenly braked, turned back, and glared at me fiercely. "No." I frowned at him, smiling slightly. "Then why are you angry?" "Because Jason likes me?" Calvin's eyes suddenly turned fierce. He closed his eyes, took a few deep breaths, pulled me into a tight embrace, and lowered his head, kissing my forehead repeatedly. "You can't betray me. You are my wife, Shelley." After a few days of silence, I found Jason White again and asked him if he wanted to get his things back. He asked, "Did you remember something?" I smiled. "I just saw some documents." I know what Calvin is doing and I'm afraid he'll go astray. Jason laughed self-deprecatingly. "You still love him." I didn't say anything. I lent money to Jason and also told him about Calvin's plan to sell his company. Jason successfully stopped Calvin and even arranged for someone to buy 30% of his company's shares. Calvin was furious in the meeting room, questioning if someone had leaked the information. After eliminating all possibilities, he finally looked at me. Holding the panda toy I bought for Annie, I innocently said. He seemed to have asked me, but I don't remember if I told him. "Calvin, did I do something wrong?" Calvin stormed out. Everyone glared at me angrily and left one by one. I sat for a long time, waiting until it got dark before knocking on Calvin's office door. The floor was littered with documents and broken teacups. He was on the phone. After he finished, I said, "Calvin, when are we getting a divorce?" Calvin looked at me in shock. "You want to divorce me?" I nodded, yes. He came out from behind his desk, grabbed my shoulders, and asked, "Why are you suddenly asking for a divorce? You helped Jason White, and I haven't even confronted you about it yet. So, divorce is the best option for us." Calvin pushed me away violently, and I almost fell, barely catching myself on the desk. "Shelley, you still can't forget Jason White even though you lost your memory. You've already betrayed me, haven't you? You've wanted to leave me for a long time, haven't you?" He shouted at me, reminding me of countless similar scenes from the past. He said I was always suspicious, that I didn't trust him, that he and Bertha were just soulmates. A few tears slid down my cheeks as I softly said, "Is it that I can't forget Jason White, or that you love Bertha but you can't admit it?" Calvin froze. I slowly took out my phone and showed him the photos and videos Bertha had sent me, both from the past and present. "In your heart, Bertha is your soulmate, always holding the most important place." I stayed at my parents' house for a week, and Calvin came to pick me up again. My parents and brother wanted us to divorce and kept him outside. "Calvin, stop harming my daughter. Annie died because of you. I don't want my daughter to die because of you too." Calvin knelt directly in front of my parents, shamelessly apologizing. "Mom, Dad, I know I was wrong before. I will treat Shelley well from now on. Please give me another chance." Bruce grabbed him and cursed, "Do you have no shame? Get lost. Don't you understand?" Calvin said, "I will keep kneeling until you forgive me." Their argument drew the neighbors' attention. Not wanting my parents to be harassed by him, I left with him. On the way back, I offered to drive and started talking to Calvin about Annie. "Did we have a child?" Calvin didn't deny it. "We did." I asked, "Where is she?" Calvin evaded, "We will have another child." I gripped the steering wheel tightly, eyes fixed ahead, and continued to ask, "Why did we get married? Was it because of the child?" Calvin impatiently interrupted, "Shelley, that's all in the past. Can't we just live well now? Do you love me?" He hesitated. I suddenly accelerated. "Because you don't love me, you would take photos with Annie and Bertha and put them in your office. Because you don't love me, when I called you to say Annie was sick, you said I was lying. You're crazy, slow down." Calvin grabbed my wrist, then suddenly looked up at me. "You remembered." I pushed him away forcefully and stepped on the gas. "I never forgot. You're the one who has been lying to me." I did forget for a while after waking up, but my memory soon returned. Although my memories were chaotic, the image of Annie's shivering, gradually cooling body and his cold voice hanging up the phone constantly haunted me. I never forgot. When the car hit the road barrier, I touched my lower abdomen with one hand, murmuring to myself, "There's a scar here." How could I not know? My Annie was here. I narrowly escaped death and managed to cling to life. Calvin Miller had one of his legs amputated and stayed in the ICU for a week before being transferred to a regular ward. He walked into the ward on crutches and asked me, "Shelley, how long are you going to torture me?" I didn't look at him, keeping my head down as I read a fairy tale to a doll. "Annie, be good, Mommy will tell you a story." He sat beside me, his voice filled with pain. I feel just as bad about Annie's death. I can empathize. Empathize? I laughed, looking at this unrepentant, cold-hearted man. "Calvin, do you empathize with me carrying Annie for 10 months, or do you empathize with Annie's pain and despair during her illness? In the minute I was on the phone, did you worry about us for even a second?" Calvin was silent. It wasn't that he couldn't answer, he just didn't dare to. He and Bertha were never innocent. Even if they hadn't slept together, they were spiritual companions, inseparable. After a long while, he finally said softly, "I'm sorry." I reached out to wipe away tears, only to find there were none. Can a belated apology bring Annie back? "Calvin, I don't want your love, I want Annie back. Can you give her to me?" It turns out that when one is in extreme grief, they can't cry. Calvin stood up and slowly knelt on the ground, holding my hand and pleading, "Shelley, can you give me another chance? I love you, and I want to make it up to you." I withdrew my hand and said softly, "Annie wouldn't agree. Because of my severe injuries, I had to stay in the hospital. If the treatment stopped, I would die. I wanted to die, but my parents didn't want me to. They couldn't bear the pain of losing another loved one. I clung to life, barely surviving. Jason White kept visiting me. He had now transformed back into the young master of the White family, regaining his former glory. Today, he once again confessed his love to me. "I've become like this, and you still like me?" I really didn't know what he liked about me, nor did I dare to ask how long he had liked me. Jason bluntly said, "I like you." Fool. I laughed and scolded him, then looked out the window and said softly, "But Jason, I can't accept you." "I know. Annie told me in a dream that Uncle Jason is very fierce, very scary." "I'm sorry." I knew Jason had been by my side ever since I lost my memory and reconciled with Calvin, afraid that I would get hurt again. He wanted to atone for his sins and was waiting to turn himself in after I divorced Calvin, which is why he confessed to me today. I suddenly reached out and hugged him, whispering in his ear. Annie also said she forgives Uncle Jason, so Uncle Jason has to live well. Jason was stunned for a long time, then buried his head in my shoulder and cried. Finally, I asked him for one thing. "Jason, help me set up a children's asthma relief fund to help more kids." "I promise you. But you must promise me to keep living." I didn't answer for a long time. That night, I dreamed of Annie. She was wearing a beautiful dress and asked, "Mommy, are you coming?" I smiled and said, "Mommy is here." 3 months later, Calvin was found dead in his apartment. The cause of death was a heart attack. In his hand, he clutched a photo, a bracelet, and a half-burned love letter. It was written to his wife Shelley, dated 2015, 10 years ago.